The kick lasted exactly 1.3 seconds from the moment his knee chambered to the moment his heel made contact. One spinning back kick, thrown by a man who weighed 135 pounds, against a woman who had never been knocked down in 8 years of professional competition across 247 consecutive victories. Tanaka Yuki was the heaviest female sumo wrestler in recorded history. 450 pounds of trained, conditioned, championship-level mass, standing nearly 6 feet tall, built for a discipline where size is not merely an advantage but the foundational currency of dominance. Bruce Lee had spent 12 minutes watching her move before he threw the kick that nobody in the arena of 11,000 people could quite process after they witnessed it. 50 years later, Japanese sports scientists are still analyzing the biomechanical footage. The numbers they keep arriving at describe something that the conventional understanding of human striking mechanics should not permit. This is the story of September 15, 1970 in Tokyo, and of the single moment where one man's understanding of physics made the impossible available. To understand how this happened, you need to understand why it almost didn't happen at all. Because the match between Bruce Lee and Tanaka Yuki was not the match anyone planned. It was the result of a withdrawal, a deadline, and a television network with money on the line, and a scheduled attraction that had just become unavailable. The East Meets West exhibition had been organized by the Japanese Sumo Association under financial pressure. Facility renovations required funding that the association didn't have. Television networks had it and were willing to provide it in exchange for content that crossed the boundary between traditional sumo and the broader combat sports audience that found foreign fighting systems fascinating. The event was controversial within sumo's institutional culture before a single match was announced. Purists argued that opening the sacred ring to outside disciplines was a concession that tradition could not survive intact. The association's financial reality answered that argument and moved on. Bruce was in Tokyo during this period filming promotional material for The Big Boss, his first major film role, the project that would introduce him to the Japanese market and through it to a global audience that his Hong Kong work had not yet fully reached. A television producer who had encountered Bruce's demonstrations approached him about participating in the exhibition, a match against a karate champion, framed as an opportunity to introduce Jeet Kune Do principles to a Japanese audience that had extensive knowledge of their own martial traditions and almost none of Chinese martial arts. Bruce agreed. The opportunity to demonstrate his system in this context interested him genuinely. 3 days before the event, the karate champion withdrew with a training injury. The producers were facing the kind of problem that television schedules create: a main attraction, a broadcast commitment, and a gap where the main attraction had been. They approached Yuki. The framing was straightforward: national television exposure for women's sumo, a division that critics had never fully accepted as legitimate, against a foreign challenger whose system nobody in Japan had encountered before. Yuki, who carried the specific frustration of someone whose excellence had been repeatedly dismissed on grounds that had nothing to do with her excellence, said yes. When Bruce learned that his opponent had changed from a karate champion to the heaviest female sumo wrestler in recorded history, his first instinct was to decline. The optics troubled him, not the competition itself. He was not concerned about the physical dimensions of what he was being asked to do, but the narrative that a 135-pound man fighting a 450-pound woman would generate, the possibility that it would read as spectacle rather than genuine martial arts exchange, bothered him at the level of principle. The producers resolved it by establishing the match's conditions on Bruce's terms: legitimate combat rules, neutral referee, no predetermined outcome, striking permitted, winner determined by knockout, submission, or ring-out. Yuki's credentials would be presented accurately. The match would be real. Bruce agreed. The weigh-in, 2 days before the event, produced photographs that dominated Tokyo's morning papers. Yuki at 450 pounds, then Bruce at 135. The visual contrast so stark that editors placed the images side by side without needing a caption. At the press conference, a journalist asked Bruce the direct question, "How does a man who weighs less than a third of his opponent plan to compete?" His answer was precise and became widely quoted in martial arts circles afterward. He said that weight was one variable in combat, that momentum and leverage and understanding of mechanical principles were equally significant, and that physics doesn't have preferences about fighting styles or body dimensions. It responds only to correct application of its own laws. Yuki heard the translation and crossed the room to speak with him, not competitively, with genuine curiosity. They spent 30 minutes discussing force generation and biomechanics, Bruce demonstrating how hip rotation and structural alignment could multiply striking power beyond what mass alone could produce. Yuki, whose entire martial career had been built on the reliable relationship between her weight and her dominance, found herself encountering concepts that her training had never addressed. They separated with mutual respect, two serious athletes looking forward to learning something from an exchange that neither could fully anticipate. September 15th arrived hot for a Tokyo autumn. Inside the Ryogoku Kokugikan, Sumo's traditional spiritual home, a venue that had hosted championship matches across centuries, 11,000 people generated an atmosphere that made the outdoor temperature irrelevant. Yuki's entrance followed Sumo's ceremony fully, the leg stomps, the salt purification, the formal introduction. The crowd responded with the enthusiasm of people watching something they understood and valued being represented on a stage that could carry it further. This was their champion, their tradition, their arena. Bruce walked to the ring in black training pants, no shirt. His physique functioning more like an anatomical diagram than a display of athletic development, every visible structure serving a purpose, nothing added beyond what combat efficiency required. Referee Kimura had been briefed thoroughly. This would not follow sumo ritual. It would follow the agreed rules of standing combat. He looked at both competitors, received confirmation, raised his fan, and the match began. Yuki moved first. Her opening technique, rapid open palm thrusts directed at Bruce's chest and face, the kind that carry natural amplification when 450 pounds is accelerating behind them, was the logical expression of her advantages. She was applying sound strategy, establish contact, use mass, impose her physical reality on an opponent she outweighed by 315 pounds. What she encountered instead was someone who was not there when her hands arrived. Bruce moved laterally, staying just outside her optimal striking distance, not retreating defensively, but relocating with purpose. He was collecting information, how her weight distributed between steps, where her balance centered when she committed forward, how her mass behaved in the instant after a technique launched and before it could be recalled. She tried to grab his waist, the classic sumo grip that would allow her to lift and remove him from the ring through sheer strength advantage. Her hands closed on air as his footwork kept the position unavailable. She showed the intelligence that had produced 147 wins. She began cutting off the ring, reducing his movement options, applying the spatial strategy that sumo's centuries of development had refined for exactly this kind of situation. Control the geography. Establish grip. Let mass do what mass does. Bruce allowed himself to be cornered. The sumo specialist watching registered this as a mistake. It was not a mistake. When Yuki drove forward with a full attacking sequence, Bruce absorbed one of the thrusts on his forearm rather than evading it. This was deliberate. He needed to feel, not just observe, how her force transferred, how 450 pounds moving at that velocity communicated itself through contact. The impact rocked him back slightly. It gave him what he needed. He now had a complete model, how her center of gravity positioned itself when she attacked, where her weight committed, and most importantly, the precise moment in her mechanical cycle when her structure was most vulnerable to disruption. He moved out of the corner with a burst of acceleration that created the impression, for observers watching her, that Yuki had suddenly slowed. She turned to face him. Her breathing had elevated slightly. Moving 450 pounds through that sequence of techniques demanded cardiovascular work that no amount of training fully eliminates. Bruce was breathing normally. His conditioning had been designed specifically for sustained intensity without accumulated oxygen debt. He had seen what he came to see. He knew what he was going to do. What happened next challenged the recording technology of 1970 to keep up with it. Standard speed cameras struggled to capture the full sequence in a form that could be analyzed frame by frame. Bruce took 3 steps, not backward, not laterally, but forward, closing distance when everything about the size differential argued for maintaining range. His 3rd step planted his left foot with his body oriented sideways to Yuki's position. His right knee came upward toward his chest. His hips began their rotation. The spinning back kick is a technique that generates its power through a principle that most striking arts underutilize: whole body rotation as a force multiplier, the entire kinetic chain from planted foot, through rotating core, through extending leg, arriving at the heel at the precise moment of maximum angular velocity. Bruce had not aimed at the obvious targets, not the chest, not the face, not the places that instinct nominates. He had aimed at a specific structural point below Yuki's center of gravity on her forward leg, just above the knee. He had chosen this target based on 12 minutes of observation and 30 minutes of biomechanical conversation and a lifetime of understanding that force application is about geometry and timing, not raw magnitude. His heel made contact at the exact moment when Yuki's weight had committed forward in preparation for her next attack. Her 450-pound mass was moving in one direction, supported at a mechanical disadvantage by a forward leg locked into the position that sumo technique trained it to occupy. Bruce's heel arrived at 1.3 seconds after he began the motion, carrying the concentrated impact of maximum rotational velocity focused into a contact point smaller than a playing card. The physics were exact. He had not attempted to move 450 pounds backward. That was genuinely beyond the available force. He had instead removed the structural foundation that 450 pounds was standing on at the precise moment when those 450 pounds had no alternative support to transition to. Her own mass committed forward with the momentum of a charging champion became the mechanism of her fall. It had nowhere to go except down. Her frame descended forward, her hands slapping the clay floor with the trained instinct that prevents injury in a fall. And Tanaka Yuki, the woman who had never been knocked down, across 8 years and 247 professional matches, was on the ground. The Kokugikan went silent with the particular quality of 11,000 people simultaneously trying to reorganize their understanding of something they had just witnessed. The referee stood without moving, his fan still raised, processing. In the front row, 3 sumo grand champions sat with expressions that had no precedent in their experience. The television commentators stopped speaking mid-sentence. One veteran announcer who had covered sumo for 4 decades said quietly into his microphone that in all those years he had never encountered anything like what he had just seen. That size in sumo was supposed to be absolute, that what he had watched appeared to violate the foundational assumptions of the discipline. Bruce stepped back immediately and bowed. Yuki remained on the clay for several seconds, not injured, but encountering a physical sensation that had no reference point in her entire competitive history. She had never been in this position. She gathered herself, pushed upward, stood. Her knee showed some redness where the heel had contacted. Nothing else. The referee conferred briefly with the sumo elders at ringside and announced the result. Bruce Lee, winner by knockout. After the media had cleared and the arena had emptied, Yuki requested a private meeting. They sat together with a translator and she asked the question directly. The way serious athletes ask questions, not for consolation, not for narrative, but because she genuinely needed to understand the mechanism. You weigh 135 pounds. I have never been knocked down by anyone. One kick from you put me on the floor. How? Bruce used a training dummy in the room to show her. He explained that her weight, the thing that had made her invincible for 8 years, created a specific structural reality that invincibility depends on. When she committed forward, all 450 pounds required a base. He hadn't attempted to overcome that mass, he lacked the physical capacity to do so, and knew it. Instead, he had spent the early minutes of the match identifying the precise moment in her movement pattern when her weight committed ahead of her structural support, a half-second window she telegraphed consistently before fully extending her forward leg into its locked weight-bearing position. That was the window. That was the target. He had simply waited for it to open and walked through it. Your own weight did the work, he told her. I just removed the floor from under it. Yuki absorbed this. Then she asked if she could learn to understand these principles. Not to replicate the technique, but to integrate biomechanical awareness into how she trained and eventually how she taught. Bruce said that this was exactly why he had devoted his life to studying martial arts. Not to prove hierarchy between systems, but to understand the physical laws that all systems operate within, whether they know it or not. Her sumo, he told her, was excellent for everything it was designed to do. But every martial art improves when its practitioners understand the physics underneath the technique. Yuki retired in 1973 with a record of 252 wins and 0 losses, the 4 additional victories coming in the years after Tokyo. She spent her post-competitive career teaching women's sumo and incorporated biomechanical principles into her curriculum, changing how a generation of sumo students understood the relationship between mass and structural vulnerability. Bruce used the match as a teaching reference for the remainder of his life, demonstrating to students that the question was never how big the problem was but where its foundation was weakest and when it was most exposed. The footage went to the Japanese Sports Science Institute, where slow-motion analysis eventually calculated Bruce's heel velocity at impact at over 50 feet per second, generating an estimated 1,100 pounds of force concentrated into a contact area smaller than a postage stamp, striking at the angle precisely calculated to compromise structural support rather than displace mass. The numbers described what the 11,000 witnesses had seen but couldn't explain. One man, one kick, 1.3 seconds, and the most complete demonstration of the principle that Bruce Lee had organized his entire martial philosophy around, that understanding the laws governing a situation is more powerful than any advantage the situation itself appears to contain.